I'm Kathleen Stevens. I'm professor at the School of Nursing. I hold the endowment for the distinguished professorship offered by Eunice, Castella. I have also been the founder of the Academic Center for Evidence-Based Practice and currently am a member of our Clinical and Translational Science Award Institute. An endowed chair is a very big privilege to receive. It allows the faculty person to apply funds that have been donated to the school toward a particular aspect of care, and the particular aspect of care for the Castella Awards are elder care research. Endowments are a community trust of the School of Nursing that enable us to use gifts and give back to the community in honor of a particular person. Excellence in nursing education goes to the point of teaching and learning activities that actually produce a change in behavior in the learner, that is new knowledge and new skills to think about something in a bit of a different way that's scientifically based and caring based. So excellence in nursing education can be drilled back to thinking about what strategies are most effective to produce that change in behavior, to produce that learning. And it has to do with thinking about the larger social demand for nursing care. Excellence of our School of Nursing derives from being very community responsive and nationally responsive as healthcare has evolved, as the profession of nursing has evolved, and as the healthcare facilities and delivery services use nurses in an expanded and growing way. Our School of Nursing has evolved in terms of content and delivering the number of nurses that Texas needs, but also in focusing the kind of skills that have been responsive to the changing aspects and the transformation of healthcare. Our excellence in nursing education has also embraced the changing strategies and the evolving technology that can be applied to nursing education. We have been very responsive in thinking about the new skill set that students are required to have in their focus not only of acute care patients, but also community-focused and family-focused, and also policy-focused. All these foci end up driving our nursing education, and our education exhibits excellence because it's focused on delivering a skill set within our students that is embedded in our current national needs. So nursing education research examines the strategies that are effective in producing that change in behavior based on new awareness and new skill sets. Nursing education research ranges quite widely from looking at student characteristics that match well with teaching styles or with teaching strategies, as well as the use of the newer technologies in producing the outcomes for learning that we hope to achieve. To study nursing education research, we might ask a simple question: is lecture effective? Or better yet, how can we deliver a lecture that actively engages the students into becoming critical thinkers and applying this knowledge into a specific case study, for example? So lecture alone has been studied, lecture with interactive problem solving has been studied, and then hands-on activities for learning have been studied. So determining what strategies, again, many of my focal areas in my work has been around what strategies are effective. So is lecture effective? Is online learning effective? What does simulation with high-fidelity mannequins produce in terms of students? And of course, currently we're looking at what additional competencies interprofessional practice and education are producing in terms of delivering high-quality services and care to patients and families. Conducting research on what strategies are most effective, that research ends up in publications of research reports, and you may find these in the nursing education journals. One research study may say this is effective for producing this learning outcome, and another may say, well, it wasn't so effective in this group. So the issue of how to combine these research studies to know what works in teaching is the point of evidence-based teaching. And early on, there were journals that were produced out of one of our nursing education national organizations that talked about the synthesis of evidence on teaching and the synthesis of nursing research so that we knew what was most effective. For example, how do we coach students in test taking? Because we need to evaluate their critical thinking. We need to evaluate their mastery of the content and their skill set. So do we say to them their first impression of the answer is the most correct one? If you go back and change it, what will happen? And we actually have research that indicates, do you leave it a first response or do you go back and reflect? So it's quite interesting to think about, even at the student point of evaluation, there's that kind of research that's evolved. The basic content is usually your first response. Our nursing evaluation tests, however, for example, in the licensure examination, require a high level of critical thinking. And so if you're hurried or distracted and you need to go back and review that question and reflect when you know that you've made it through your time frame, then going back and reflecting on those complex questions is probably a good strategy. So my experience about being inducted into the Nursing Research Hall of Fame was quite a surprise. The joy that I received of being recognized as a researcher in evidence-based practice was close to overwhelming. It came in tandem with the Episteme Award received by the Nursing Honor Society. And I had folks come up after the presentation and express their happiness that a nurse who had been studying in evidence-based practice had received this award. There are many nurse researchers that have drilled down in the study of pediatric care or in the study of workforce aspects of nurse-to-patient ratio safety. And yet this was the first real acknowledgement and celebration that evidence-based practice had grown roots and was fully embraced by the National Honor Society, International Honor Society, and by the worldview on thinking about evidence-based practice in nursing. It was held in Australia, and this induction in 2012 was one of the early cohorts that was inducted into the Hall of Fame, and it's been a continued tradition that is highly valued in nursing research. The audience, there were probably about close to 3,000 people in the audience, so it was a very large venue. And from the back, you could see the main screen, and then there was a series of 6 additional screens through, paced throughout the entire venue at the ceilings. And I had prepared a Prezi Award. I like the idea of boldly going where no one's gone before as an innovator. And so I love the space theme. And the Prezi Award allowed me to move the PowerPoint slides into topics and then out of topics. And from the back, it was almost a dizzying experience of moving in and out, and was quite a fun event for me to present. It's been a joy to have a career in nursing at this point in time. The span of years and evolutions that I've been in with nursing began when nursing was first declared a science, and that we should build a science upon which to base our practice. So nursing care is practical. Nursing care is now applied science. So the application of what we find in these research studies is a very big part of the current work in the clinical and translational science area. At the base, I always like to think of it this way. The public expects us to pick an intervention for which we know the likelihood of causing the desired health outcome, and to demonstrate that a systematic look and testing of, well, if I do X, will Y actually happen, is at the core of what nursing research is. And so nursing research has always been, for me, directly connected to the care and the care outcomes that we want to see. Because otherwise, nursing research is such a long process. It's a very technical process with data and analysis, and from thought of conception to funding to getting the answer for your research question is a minimum of 3 years. And nurses are right now people. We're hands-on people. So I always thought in the early stages of my research career that if I were to become involved in research, it would have to have a direct impact on patient care. At the bottom line, the public wants us to be licensed because we know what the likelihood of one intervention is in producing the health outcome that we've set as a goal. Higher wellness, alleviation of a symptom, the aspect of family and mental health and community. All these things are the applied part, but our licensure is a reflection of the fact that we are a scientifically based profession. We combine that science, of course, with our expertise and patient preference to produce what's known as best practice. So the preparation of nursing into a doctorate of philosophy is classically a preparation for designing and conducting research studies. I've always engaged students in the master's program who are essentially the clinicians that come back to further their care capability in being the real innovators, the real observers of what the clinical problems are, and those prepared with a PhD with the research background are the technicians. The technical aspect of how you design a project to assure that you're going to be able to trust the answer that you get. The sample size is large enough. The analysis that you're using is well developed and appropriate for the question. So that aspect of research and having a PhD level, a doctorally prepared nurse who has those technical skills in analysis and design, are a marriage with the clinician perspective on these are the burning priorities that we have to solve either at a health systems level or at an individual patient level. So the doctoral preparation of nurses for practice parallels a joyful occurrence of the evolution of translational science and evidence-based practice. Doctorates in nursing practice, or DNPs, are prepared for a role to move the evidence into practice. They are change agents. And that level must understand what the research is suggesting as best practice, but also must be high-level champions and facilitators of practice change. And so the DNP is a wonderfully welcomed role as our healthcare is transforming to better care using science, better outcomes by applying that science to patient care, patient outcomes, and then better value in terms of doing things that we know will work. In the year 1999, the Institute of Medicine said, our healthcare delivery is harming patients. There's a gap between what we know and what we do with patients. And Chapter 7 in that book is about evidence-based practice being part of the solution. Subsequent to that, in 2004, the National Institutes of Health declared that there was a bridge-building activity known as the Clinical and Translational Science Award. Dr. Zuhuni announced this, and I remember I was at the meeting when I first heard this, that there was this bridge being built, and crossing the quality chasm from the Institute of Medicine is usually depicted with an image of a bridge. So it was an absolute game changer, a sea change for thinking about how do the billions of dollars that the National Institutes of Health has invested in the world's largest research enterprise in health, how does it become more impactful on population health? In other words, the health that individuals, families, communities, and our whole population ends up enjoying as the return on investment of this research. So the Clinical and Translational Science Award, or CTSA as it's called, was initially developed here at the Health Science Center beginning in 2008. We had a planning grant, and we've been funded subsequently since then. And it casts a broad net across translation from basic to clinical trials to implementation in clinical practice to affecting policy even. And so the area that I was particularly interested in that matched evidence-based practice is that translational science that's called implementation science. With this banner in hand, evidence-based practice, being an early EBP pioneer, I watched the adoption and the slow awareness and recognition of evidence-based practice as being so crucial in our clinical decision-making for nurses, for physicians, for occupational therapists, for social workers. The world has sort of embraced that best care can be derived from this evidence. And thinking about where I could help guide some of the thinking, there's the Association of Clinical and Translational Science, or ACTS. And recently, I set my hat for gaining a position on the board of directors for the ACTS so that I could begin to express the willingness and the capability, particularly of nurses and other professional disciplines, to add to that implementation part of translational science. I was the first nurse nominated, the first nurse elected. I'm in my second of 3-year terms, so I'm very happy to say that I have a rhythm with the board. And the Health Science Center, CTSA, called the Institute for Integration of Medicine and Science, IIMS, Dr. Clark is the PI for that. Bob Clark helped me. With the help of Bob Clark, I was elected initially and re-elected. So the outcome of the participation of raising the awareness that my particular profession has a great amount to contribute to the transformation of healthcare is reflected in the 4 years of programming in the conference that ACTS sponsors. The Translational Science Conference in 2019 will have its 4th presentation on implementation research, and we have, as a board, engaged nationally recognized implementation research experts to present at what is traditionally a drug development, clinical trials, and now evolving to embrace this down the pipeline of adopting evidence into practice. ACTS has the Journal of Clinical and Translational Science, and as early as I could, as a board member, I volunteered to be one of the senior editors on that journal. And I'm happy to say that very close to having a proposal approved, another expert, Jonathan Tobin, and I will be guest co-editors for a special journal issue on implementation research. So the Institute of Medicine publication on crossing the quality chasm has been followed up by a number of other reports by this thought-leading institute for policy making and thinking about where we are and what can be done. That whole series of reports has looked at medication errors, has looked at as a safety issue, has looked at the full role of the nurse in the report called The Future of Nursing, has looked at what we know about healthcare in a series that's called Knowing What Works in Healthcare. That title says it's all for me, and I use that as an anchor point for thinking about if we know that something works and it's not being integrated into common care, into our ordinary daily practice, then there's a gap between the quality that we could give and the quality that we actually give. And so the outcome becomes far less than what it could be for the patient's health. If we weren't practicing giving beta blockers to people entering the emergency department early on at about a 50% rate, then those people with heart conditions were not enjoying as good a health outcome as they could have had best evidence-based practice been employed. And there are many, many examples that our healthcare delivery systems have focused on and have become very concerted in their efforts to improve the timeline between our discovery and what patients actually receive. That is usually identified as a 17-year time lapse to get through that pipeline. And even if it gets through the pipeline, there's a far reduced number of practices that adopt it. So if we circle back to what is learning, we circle back to change in behavior. If we circle back to showing up with this, what looks like an innovative, albeit research-based intervention that's known to be effective, we have to enter into that microsystem, that microcosm, that unit level, that physician practice, that nursing group, saying, we have something new for you to try. And that change in behavior is a release of what we know and adopting this now new level as a novice of incorporating this practice. We may not even have the supplies to implement this new practice. So part of managing change in learning and using strategic approaches that are known to be helpful, moving research into practice is the basis of changing behavior. The confidence that has to come in that evidence and in that clinical practice guideline that's been built around that evidence has to be embraced by everyone in that healthcare delivery system. So the idea of moving evidence into practice becomes an issue of organizational change and raising up the awareness that nurses have this immense capacity for understanding the system of care in terms of how do we keep it flowing on a 24/7, 365 basis while other health professions come in and out, makes the nurse knowledgeable in a key function area for transforming healthcare with evidence. It's hard to find an elevator speech in 15 years of experience. Actually, even before that, I was involved in research and went, whoa, research is just too tedious for a nurse. You know, we are compassionate with patients and we want to have hands-on, and the research process demands that we be extremely systematic about discovering the conclusion to answer our question. So thinking about the patients for research and moving research into impacting patient care was a high priority before I even came to San Antonio in 1989. And that theme has recurred in my career and in my passion and what the ways I've reinvented sort of the direction of my career, which ended up in my speaking out at an interprofessional group about funding for grants and how grants needed to be interprofessional, that they would be better received by NIH if there were multiple professions at the table on the scientific team. And this occurred in 1999. So that Saturday, I received a phone call from the person who was putting in a grant for the VA at that coming week, asking me to be on the investigative team. And that began a solid career in evidence-based practice, because that was the verdict center of excellence that the VA stood up to specifically address evidence-based practice. And it was an attempt over those early years to really engage broadly the profession of nursing, and the suggestion was made to stand up a guidepost in the School of Nursing. And so the academic center, as juxtaposed to the clinical center of the VA, the Academic Center for Evidence-Based Practice, or ACE, was authorized in January of 2000 as the first center of excellence of its kind in the School of Nursing, along with the Center for Violence Prevention. So the Center of Excellence, to me, meant an aggregate of like-minded people and converging thoughts in this new field of what is evidence-based practice? Why is it so important? Why should nurses be a part of it? And together with a very broad community, we created a number of things. That very broad community was brought together by being sort of a public entity for the nation. And we did that by establishing a very scary first step in hosting one of the nation's first evidence-based practice conferences. And for 14 years, we had upwards of 350, 400 people who would come every summer for the Summer Institutes on Evidence-Based Practice and Quality Improvement, and became almost a community of practice in itself. These folks still have connections with each other across the nation and connections with me. So it wasn't a lone experience. It was truly amassing multiple thoughts and with an ear to the ground of what was happening in the clinical world. And so I always think of ACE as being a very outward-looking, clinical practice-serving type of center of excellence for quality, bridging evidence into quality improvement, and also patient safety, because you can't have quality unless the care is safe. So those became the themes of the Summer Institutes on Evidence-Based Practice, and we convened amazing speakers. We convened the experts that we wanted to hear from and continued to learn and grow. Early on, I was repeatedly asked by a small group, a weekly meeting that we had starting in 2000 in the School of Nursing. People were curious, faculty were curious, and they came and we sat and we talked and we drew on the board, and they would say, what is evidence-based practice? And I would write up 5 steps. Well, it is the original research. It is the synthesis of all the research, what's known about the topic. It is the guideline recommendation. It is actually putting it into practice. And it is evaluating the impact on the process and on the patient outcome. And one person, I remember it like it was yesterday, said, well, that's 5 points. Why don't you make it a star? Because, of course, we're deeply dyed in Texas. So is it the Texas star model? It's been amusingly called occasionally. But those are the 5 steps. And the point is about this star model, it describes the difficulty or why we have difficulty in moving a single research report directly into practice. It's because it's not the appropriate form of knowledge. it's a single research study. But if you move it through a systematic review and get all the knowledge on what's known about what works, and then have experts say, we know this and we recommend this to be into practice, and then have clinicians helped and championed in adopting that practice. That's point 4 of the star, if you see I'm moving around it. And then finally evaluating the impact. Then we understand how we can't really get very easily from point 1 to point 4 in terms of changing practice. It's sort of a meta theory. I worked with Dr. Imogene King in her last 3 years, and she said, you know, Kathleen, it's not a model. It's a theory. And so I've tried to take that forward in understanding what she was telling me, because she was one of, a handful of great nursing theorists that they were tasked by their educational program that if nursing was to become university-based, that meant we had to have research for our science. And if we needed research for a science, we needed theories. And so their exit paper, if you will, their big project was to generate a theory, a nursing theory, and publish it. And of course, Imogene is famous for her Toward a Theory in Nursing book. That's what and I said, Dr. King, she said, oh, call me Imogene. She said, I said, why is it this is the title of your book? And then she had later a system theory that evolved. She said, because I kind of didn't finish the whole theory, but I was moving us toward a theory. And that's been just such a treasure. It tells me that evolution of theory and science and care in nursing and medicine and related health fields is indeed an evolution. We'll keep discovering and keep improving and keep evolving. So that's been a great evolution. But the Academic Center for Evidence-Based Practice had a very broad approach to advancing evidence-based practice. We adopted what was known out of clinical epidemiology. Evidence-based practice is best research evidence combined with clinical expertise and tempered with patient preferences. And so that's always been the definition used in the Academic Center for Evidence-Based Practice. And early on, faculty wanted to know, people wanted to know, clinicians wanted to know, what do these competencies look like in the nursing workforce? So one of the earliest projects was to do a national Delphi we did this over a 3-year period of a roundtable that came together and formed a consensus on competencies in nursing for evidence-based practice. So those essential competencies became the foundation of a survey instrument, and the STAR model and the competencies and that evidence-based practice readiness inventory are all being used by multiple others in their research. It's been adopted into their magnet journey. It's been used in dissertations. And so the contribution that coming together every year with people who asked questions and provided many of the answers in this new pioneering field of evidence-based practice in nursing was one of the strong hallmarks of the Academic Center for Evidence-Based Practice. So the work in evidence-based practice made a logical foundation for looking at the science of improvement. Evidence-based practice is knowing what works. That's like point 2 and 3 of the STAR. Improvement science is about getting it into the hands and the usage and the routines of clinicians. So again, this work is really directed toward clinicians and students or clinicians in training, right? So I don't discount that this needs to be really integrated into the students' critical thinking and clinical decision making. The point of improvement science is to determine what strategies work in changing that situation in the clinical care delivery, in changing the non-use of beta blockers for people coming into the emergency department to everybody who qualifies for the use of beta blockers receives it. There are many examples of that, along with the idea of knowing what works in improving care and then making it happen through the roles of champions, change agents. Deming was a classic example of leading the way in quality improvement. So elevating evidence-based practice thinking to the idea of, well, let's study what works, was a very short step. And with clinicians involved, as I described through the summer institutes, the Improvement Science Research Network was created to study organizational interventions that work for improving care, for improving patient safety. And this was nationally funded and built a nationwide network for conducting studies asking those questions. What happens when nurses are administering medications and they get interrupted or distracted? Does the number of errors in medication administration go up? And so we fashioned a project across the nation that looked at determining what's called cognitive load. And it talks about, well, a nurse has a plan to administer this medication. It's a complex process. And it's placed in the middle of an environment that's very busy and very distracting and has many, many priorities. And so how do you protect that decision process and the follow-through from those interruptions that end up being perhaps an error or a near miss in medication safety? So those are the examples of one kind of study that the Improvement Science Research Network was able to mount, because when you ask that kind of a question, you can't simply do it on one nursing unit or on 10 nursing units in a single facility, because then you just have a picture of a single facility. So you need multiple facilities. So the network was meant to come around the priorities that our clinical partners identified through our national survey early on as their priorities, and then to conduct research, improvement science types of questions across multiple sites with the guidance of a center helping the conduct of that study be highly rigorous. So the rigor in the clinical setting was something that the Improvement Science Research Network core team built tools for and had, weekly conferences as they were conducting the research to be certain that the research was being conducted to very high standards. So the magic of the Improvement Science Research Network was to pull together around these questions that are about complex adaptive systems in such a way where we didn't have a one-off kind of answer, but we had an answer across 29 facilities. So then the conclusion was that this is likely to work in many, many places for the improvement of that particular patient's safety issue. We were taken with the idea that there were systems that failed the front line in delivery of care. And Dr. Robert Ferrer came to me when I said, let's do something together, Bob. And we won a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant early on, looking at what he called small troubles, adaptive responses. So he's very clever because that spells STAR. So we call it the STAR Project. And it had to do with nurses encountering the inavailability of linens to do skin care for a patient. And the workaround then became the work of two industrial engineers in the field. And workarounds cause big questions for patient safety because you're no longer following the standard scientifically based care. You don't have something, and so you work around it because you have to get care done. And so these front-end problems are called operational failures. The medication comes up from the pharmacy and it's twice the dose that's actually ordered. The nurse is thinking about this and says, it's twice the dose, it's time to deliver it, I'm going to squirt out half of it, and administers the correct dose to the patient, but gets swept away in the rest of the duties that there was no feedback to the pharmacy. And so that correction wasn't made down at the source of the error. So you can see how weaving together a very strong team that identifies failures and addresses them becomes part of the patient safety research. So thinking about the STAR project, we've had over 30 hospitals participate. And we're the first published nursing research study in the literature that used high reliability organizations framework are from high risk industries, such as nuclear energy, such as going into outer space. So these redundant feedback loops that engage the front line are so important. And we found the frontline nurses so receptive to carrying around a green pocket card and reporting their operational failures. I mean, we had tens of thousands of operational failures reported by about 1,000 nurses across these agencies. And just by bringing the awareness up, many, many rectifications were made. I mean, in problem solving, half of the problem is solved when you can identify what the problem is. So I think that it was, in and of itself, an intervention. I'm still asked for the green card. Can we use the green card as our intervention? Nurse managers love it. Nurse managers have said, you know, I thought there was something that was awry in this process. I kept seeing these little hiccups, but now I have the evidence. I can buy more infusion pumps because they were working around those problems. I can buy, a better distribution of clean linens. And so many of these problems have been solved just by raising the awareness of the problem. So the question to distinguish improvement science from translational science is one that's being addressed nationally. Both are new sciences, and neither, and I'll give you some other terms, but neither one of those sciences have stabilized terminology yet. And so we add implementation science and research, and we add dissemination science and research. These are translational science, I would say, through my lens, is a broad umbrella talking about everything that transforms knowledge, from the discovery at the chemical level to the use in rats to the experimentation and clinical trials with people, and discovering that this intervention actually works and moving it into adoption. So implementation science is about what strategies work to promote adoption. And then onward into policy, because policy works, in the reverse to accelerate adoption. I'll give you an example. We know that hospital readmissions can be avoided for a number of patients. Hospital readmissions are a patient safety issue. Hospital readmissions are costly. We send patients home, and to be readmitted to hospital is a giant burden in many, many ways, financially, emotionally. So the policy level on that is that hospitals are now penalized if they don't reduce to a certain level their avoidable hospital readmissions. So that's an example of policy, and that particular one is a pay-for-performance policy, that hospitals then are now looking at ways to reduce hospital readmissions, backing up into evidence-based practices that we know to be effective. One of which is we have to have two big things I'll name. One is medication reconciliation and the availability of any new medication to that patient as they go home. Think about that transition. It's very tumultuous. It's getting a patient back home. It's now we have to go to pharmacy and pick it up. So how do we make that happen to where they're equipped with what they need at home? And the second one is thinking about having that next appointment for a checkup. Because if a patient gets in trouble 2 weeks out and they should have had a 1-week appointment, that could have been avoided. So those are two evidence-based practices that we know that work to reduce avoidable hospital readmissions and bump into the issue of how do we change practice? Part of it is that we change it with policy. So the question about TeamSTEPPS is a great one to illustrate many of the principles that have driven my career in the last number of years. And TeamSTEPPS stands for Team, Strategies, and Tools to Enhance Performance and Patient Safety. So now we're enhancing team performance and patient safety. And the issue came up when it was discovered in one healthcare facility that looking at the root cause analysis of patient deaths from medical adverse events demonstrated that 80% of these deaths occurred as a direct cause of ineffective, insufficient team communication. And so all of a sudden, team communication became a magnet to figure out what will make team communication stronger. And we turned to human factors engineers to look at how people interface as a team. So the whole issue of teaming and team-based care was brought to a pinnacle within the Department of Defense because they dispatch teams and their teams turn over rapidly. And so the evidence was drawn out of human factors engineering, summarized, and put into strategies and tools in this program called TeamSTEPPS. And it helps the healthcare team interact in such a way that it's a tight communication, it's crisp, it's efficient, and everything is covered. So the brief in the morning is, here's our plan of care. And then when something goes off pattern, there's a huddle, and it's to refocus and redirect if the patient's condition has changed. And then at the end of the day, there's a debrief. There's a way to think about this communication as, I'm observing this, we're on the team, and I see that we're departing a bit from best care or we're getting into an unsafe zone. So there are tools and strategies to help stop the line and say, I don't have the sponge count correct. We need to not close this surgical patient just yet until we get it this counted. So that is a team communication issue. Or to say, I'm uncomfortable with this. It seems like there's a piece not being entered into our rounds discussion with this patient. Did you see this particular? So it's like having my back. And I'm so thankful when people have my back in terms of, whoa, did you notice this? Because that makes our care more effective, more efficient, but importantly, safer for patients. As a result of the Department of Defense development of this evidence-based team practice to improve and enhance patient safety, the entire curriculum, including videos and a full set of PowerPoints and an instructor's manual that's this big, was launched from the Department of Defense through the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality out to the civilian world in 2006. And it was, for me, it's the perfect case example of evidence amassed and placed into tools and strategies that are ready to implement. And so the TeamSTEPPS curriculum is a federal standardized curriculum complete with all of those things, including instruments to measure team attitude, team perception, evaluation framework for looking at 4 different levels of adoption, So it is a great case study of having a complete best practice packaged and ready for implementation. Implementation science tells us that you can have the best widget in the world, but until there's buy-in, until a problem is recognized, and there's full support of the culture of that organization, it won't get adopted. So now on point 4 of the STAR, as we move TeamSTEPPS into adoption, it changes behavior. And it changes the way that the various disciplines on the healthcare team have interacted in the past to a better, stronger communication to assure patient safety. But it still takes that intervention and full facilitation of a champion to have that new behavior embraced by the care providers. In 2012, the Choosing Wisely campaign was launched in medicine with the medical associations coming together asking this question: is there any low-value care that we can point to the evidence and say, we probably should stop doing this? Or is there any evidence pointing to particular care activities that are actually harmful to patients or are expensive? I mean, that in a way, cost is a harm in a way, so that are expensive that produce no benefit. And so the idea was that patients and providers would come together and choose wisely those interventions that would be invested in their diagnosis and treatment. Nursing became part of that initiative, bringing forth nursing care issues that had very little evidence to support their effectiveness, or maybe even evidence that they were ineffective. One example is, it's the subject of so many cartoons, Mr. Smith, wake up, I have your sleeping pill. Saying it out loud and bringing it to the attention is a patient satisfaction thing. It's a healthier idea. It doesn't have a lot of evidence that actually administering a sleeping pill during a sleep cycle is effective in getting more rest. Another one is a particular concoction of mouthwash that patients who have undergone chemotherapy have oral mucus issues, and there's a particular mouthwash that is not recommended because it actually interferes with the healing cells, the healing of the cells in the oral mucosa. So those are examples. One that is a bit exemplary of how difficult it might be to change behavior is fetal heart rate monitoring. And we're all relieved when we can see a laboring mother and that little heartbeat going at the right rate. And the evidence is a bit contradictory about, whether or not it's beneficial. And at the same time, there's that opposite force saying, but we have to have the monitoring. There have been incidents that it would have caught an early deceleration. So that's a policy struggle. There's a legal political aspect to fetal heart rate monitoring that the Choosing Wisely campaign has to look at and adopt within the local culture. So this, again, on point 4 of adopting into practice, has to account for the patient preference and also has to account for the local practice. I'll tell you another little piece about choosing wisely. The Choosing Wisely recommendations are like clinical practice guidelines. I call them the flip side of evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice, you want to go with that. And Choosing Wisely, you want to stop. So in the field of implementation research, we're now studying de-implementation, so how to remove that practice when there are so many forces pushing it. But if the evidence is strong on low-value care, we need to remove it. Ineffective care, we need to remove it because we have effective care that can move in and lessen the load for the patient and the provider. So the changes in teaching and the changes in learning interface with each other, and they're both based in the context of social need for nursing care. Our students come from the general public. Our faculty live in the general public. So many of the forces in our society have affected that teaching and learning activity. Teaching and learning is essentially a form of communication, right? So as the technology infrastructure has become available and the venues and channels have evolved, so has the communication that occurs in teaching and learning. Initially, we were very concrete oriented. I mean, right here, right now, with something concrete in your hand. I recall the blue slides with white letters that were the classic. In every medical conference, every nursing conference, very few images, and but I mean, they were the physical slides that we used. The evolution of that being accompanied by audio. As a student sat at these monitors with these big headgears on and viewed the TV monitor as it moved through the visual slides, and the lecture actually was delivered, the points were delivered in an audio recording. So that evolved, and I think we have only recently seen some of that equipment repurposed, not here, but it went away from our School of Nursing. The next thing was a realization that because learning occurs on multiple levels, emotional, attitudinal, value shifts, content, skills, all of those levels, we discovered early in educational research that one of the most impactful ways to change attitudes and values was via video. And so now we had, 8-track, and then now we have streaming, but video became a very visual part to add to the audio and the movement, and we now teach physical assessment with some very high-end videos that are accompanied with real-life practice, mannequin and standardized patient practice, as well as the connected textbook and online modules for self-testing. So education, teaching and learning have broadened out in so many resources that are now provided technologically. The basis of nursing, teaching and learning is the content that affects the critical thinking, which is also impacted by attitudes and values and awareness of the breadth of cultural beliefs and contexts, along with the hand skills. So it's critical thinking plus the hand skills. So however those content issues are conveyed or communicated to students in their learning evolution is always practiced in a clinical setting. Those two elements have always been the absolute go-to core of nursing education, even before we were within universities. Some of it was on-the-job training, along with instruction that was delivered on the job. So we have always been a hands-on profession, and I think that education really boils down to producing those critical thinking skills and the skill set that provides hands-on care. In addition to the breadth of communication venues, is Facebook and texting now part of teaching? Certainly part of our information flow. but the identification of the use of mannequins, starting from the ragdoll, the life-size ragdoll that we had in our teaching and learning lab, skills lab, to high-fidelity mannequins for which we've devoted what looks like a hospital space with beds and clinics to these mannequins that can be programmed, and the students' interaction and care with those are actually responded to by the mannequin or by the patient, and then it can be reviewed and corrective feedback can be given. So that's the ultimate. Clinical teaching is the most complex teaching that can occur. You have a group of students, you have patients in need, you have staff who are caring for the patients, and the faculty is usually almost a guest in the institution, comes on maybe for 2 days with the patients, and we all have to integrate within the planned care. So one of the biggest evolutions that I think our School of Nursing has seen is the development of what's called the Dedicated Education Unit. And this is where the faculty and the course and the students and what the students need to achieve in their objectives come together with a clinically based preceptor in the actual unit. The preceptor has at heart and knowledge and continuity the best practices for that particular patient, knows the pattern, knows what's changed from yesterday. And so together, this preceptor in the dedicated education unit, the student and the faculty create a powerful team to deliver high-quality care that's overseen by the healthcare facility. The learning is supervised by the faculty, and the student emerges with an amazing experience and a connection to that unit. Our first room with video conferencing was called long distance education. So my experience in teaching in what you call the longest serving faculty role here at the School of Nursing had to do with the connection, the PhD program that we created as a Texas-wide consortium. Texas Tech and Lubbock was involved, Corpus Christi became involved, and we did do video conferencing. By and large, it was at the real-time video conferencing, and that was the long-distance conferencing or the long-distance teaching room. We had these monitors set up. We could see them, they could see you. Now with the evolution of technology, it goes through websites, and we have many options for web-based conferencing and teaching. And we can also capture it to where the recording can be reviewed or seen by students at an asynchronous time. So yes, I was part of that first PhD, first class in research methods that connected North and South to build our PhD program. Then in 1991, I had some postdoc training in informatics, which was, if you think in 1991, that was like 18 years before the iPhone was even in our hands. 18 years before the iPhone was even in our hands. And thinking about doing this with looking at research and having a computer synthesize what is known about that topic. So I did this with Judith Graves, who is considered the founder of nursing informatics. Came back, and in 1992, way before courseware, online, Blackboard, Canvas was even invented, pieced together some things that seemed to mimic teaching strategies. Like we had a live chat. We had, go and find this kinds of, much of it came out of the library in terms of what the library had already built up in the web services that were, I think, some of the early pioneers in our Health Science Center with using web-based resources. And so that became the first online course, as perfunctory as it was, as Model T-ish as it was. And actually, most faculty didn't have computers on their desks. So that was quite nor did we have email accounts. So is it a long time to have experienced that? I think, the technology just gets adopted at an exponential rate. So probably many years to some people, but really in the evolution of the world, a very short time period in years. And now we look at the Internet of Things as the next frontier. Actually, we're well into the frontier. And thinking about how patients have many, many pieces of equipment that feed into electronically to a central decision support aid that's computerized, and how these systems are vulnerable to cyber security issues. And I'm working with a very brilliant person, Dr. Zizi Sawan, looking at how to protect the Internet of Things that are in the patient care area. It's a patient safety issue, you see, in terms of protection against ransomware. So the future of where this can go is, again, going to be mimicked in where our society is headed. Nursing research is development in my career, very early career, of producing a science on which we base our nursing care so that we know if we use this intervention, we're likely to produce the outcome. It's what is effective, what works in healthcare. So the concerns of nurses in terms of what works are things like symptom management. What's the most effective way to manage pain? Of course, there are medications, but they have the downside. What are effective non-medication-based ways to manage or even to assess pain? Pain assessment has come a long way because nurse researchers have said, what's the best way for a patient to express their level of pain? Helping people make healthy choices in their lifestyle, in their eating, in their smoking and drinking behavior, or in dangerous activities. Living well, living healthy is part of what nurses help to do in terms of family interventions, intervening in school health, providing the support for the research that helps understand how to better manage asthma in the child school setting, for example. Other aspects are how to really support people to maximally function, although the aging years begins to take away some of their functional ability. So elder research is a key priority, and nurses helping people through understanding what makes a safer home. Research shows us that preventing falls can be done with this evidence-based practice and this evidence-based practice. So making that happen in a patient's care setting or home setting is a key focus of nursing research. Nursing research has to do with looking at family and community, helping new parents become the best parents that they can be to stimulate that early child growth and development. Also in thinking about being active participants in transforming our actual care delivery, our delivery and transforming health care through the system in terms of tightening that team-based care communication and helping the organization understand how not having supplies or equipment really has a bad impact on patient safety. So restructuring systems issues is a really big part and focus of nursing research. Patient safety research in terms of placing something in the patient's hands that helps them become vigilant partners in their own care. The Louise Batts Patient Safety Foundation, for example, has created, after an adverse medical event took the life of the mom, Louise Batts, the daughter founded this Patient Safety Foundation with the mantra that my mother's death will not be the end of her legacy. We will find solutions. So she created the Batts Guide, which has been used to help patients monitor their medications, the procedures, and so it sort of empowers them and their family and the staff, because the patients then can ask questions in raising their own patient safety. So there's research there. So nursing research focuses on the actual care and the workforce, because I think that nursing is a kind of function that takes compassion, so looking at compassion fatigue, making our workforce strong, looking at the impact of 12-hour shifts on fatigue and patient safety, and then the patient-to-nurse ratio is also a point of study. So it's a broad gamut that nursing research examines to make the profession stronger and to deliver what we're licensed to deliver to the public. So to comment on the building, the School of Nursing here in San Antonio, I'm connecting it back to when I was a young faculty in Houston, because our two schools, as a matter of fact, 6 or 7 schools across the state, were connected at a UT system level. So although I wasn't here when this School of Nursing initially opened, I was part of what was called the system-wide faculty, and we met at each other's facilities. So I was very well aware of the wonderful facility being built here, although I was teaching at the time in Houston in the parking garage basement of Herman Hospital. So the school here had temporary buildings, from what I understand. It was a great joy to see the beautiful architectural design evolve in the School of Nursing here, and I recall the first faculty, system-wide faculty that we had and here at the School of Nursing, and how intrigued I was with the attention that had been built into our built environment, and that in fact we were recognizing that teaching and learning and human existence is much better in lovely aesthetic surroundings. So the fountain became a center point. Any faculty that I would address nationally, that, oh, you work at UT School of Nursing in San Antonio, I've been to that building, what about that fountain? And so it's a luxury that a state building really didn't have, and was, like I said, designed into the feature of having this beautiful, uplifting environment that we know accelerates learning. So I think the tandem of the built environment and the learning is crucial. The other parts of the history that I recall is that the art is some of the unusual feature of our School of Nursing. There may be schools of nursing that look more, institutional, with purchased poster art, which is lovely and a good attempt, but ours is real art. And I believe the way that came about is that we had the interest of a development person, a development group, that said the School of Nursing needs more aesthetics. Let's ask benefactors to donate art, real art, to place into the School of Nursing. And the benefactors had to donate art that was produced by Texas artists. So, it's Texas to the bone. And some of it is very well received. Some of it is a reflection of the particular era in time. So 1976 there was a lot of hippie images, and I think even some faculty had the bell-bottom denims and such. But it's very precious art, and I think the history of the art is unique in the nation for the School of Nursing, and then that legacy was carried on by Dr. Joanne Crow, who was an artist. She finished in design and came and helped us with a lot of the audiovisual activities here in the School of Nursing, and brought some of her own art into the school and has it placed around its very meaningful art. So the issue of how the school was built with tiered classrooms and the famous kivas, which I understand is a Native American term used for convening a group for decision making or for discussion, right? So these kivas are well known to all of our alum and any faculty that's been here as, well, what's that? And what was it used for? They were sort of sunken and round benches and initially did not have TV monitors in them, nor tables. And this was built, oddly enough, around a very highly accepted strategy for teaching. And it was called learning through discussion. And I think it survives, the principles survive in our small group discussions and case-based problem solving. But this was the physical acknowledgement for having small group discussions among our students. And the kivas have now gone the way of evolving into classrooms that still accommodate small group discussions, but are updated, and thankfully, with the evolution of technology and the use of technology by students during their learning, many more plugs. Electrical plugs were in very short supply.